Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Duke Football Coverage Podcast, brought to you as always by Bull City Coordinators. Please check us out at our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. You can follow us on Twitter at DukeFBCoverage. We are everywhere that you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify, Anchor, etc., and so forth. You know my DMs are open. You know the other forums I'm on, Reddit, the Duke Basketball Report forums. You know how to find me. So we are going to get right into this interview with our next guest who played football at Duke from 2008 until 2011. If I left a season off, I will get corrected quickly. He played tight end for the Blue Devils. He is from Canada originally and now is an economics expert. And fun fact, the reason that I reached out to have him on is because my wife, who keeps up on economic trends, found him on Twitter and said, you have got to get George on the podcast. So that has come forth. Mrs. Bull City Coordinators, if you are listening, I have completed yet another item on the honeydew list. So that should count for something. George Pearkes, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good, Ben. It sounds like we share a similar quality in that we both have a much, much better half.
Well, when I interviewed John Latina, and I agree with you, I have a much better half. But when I interviewed John Latina, he mentioned how important wives were, and he kept talking about how important wives were. And I said, I need to stop this because my wife listens to this podcast, so I gotta tone some of this stuff down. But you mentioned before we went on the record, you're in Charlotte now. Why don't you take a few moments, catch everybody up with what you're doing these days?
So I am the global macro strategist for Bespoke Investment Group. What that means in English is I do research on economic and financial market trends around the world, with an eye to helping investors understand what's going on in markets and position themselves accordingly. We are a small independent research firm, about 6 or 7 folks now, and we also manage portfolios for folks as well through a separate business line. I've been with Bespoke since about 2014. I've been living in North Carolina since 2016. We moved down here when my wife went off to law school at Wake Forest. We had met in New York. I'd been there for about 4 years, and that big city life was about enough for me. So we moved to Winston-Salem, and we've been in North Carolina since then, and it's just great.
When did she finish up law school? I'm a lawyer, so I'm gonna dovetail this for a little bit into something that I'm selfishly interested in.
So she finished up in the fall of 2018 and then did an externship to finish off her time, graduated in 2019. So we've been in Charlotte since, first week of 2019.
And what kind of law is she practicing?
My wife, Raquel, is a commercial litigator, business fights, basically, does all kinds of stuff related to contracts and disputes for a firm here in Charlotte called Moore & Allen.
Well, that's fantastic. Commercial disputes are a lot like domestic disputes. So it can be fun and profitable, but also kind of a pain in the neck. So good luck with that.
Yeah. Slightly lower stakes in some respects, I think. Typically, the commercial litigants don't have a history of violence with one another, but beyond that.
Well, the domestic work, when you're splitting up a marriage and, kids and dividing up the custody, it becomes sometimes a lot more about the airing of grievances with your spouse than about, we just need to make a deal and get this done. Right. So, and the firm I used to work at used to do a lot of business litigation, and there was a lot of that.
Yep, for sure. My dad was an attorney also, or is an attorney also. And his practice he described as fights, no blood, no kids. So I think the intensity of the disputes there can definitely be not so great for the attorney on either side of a fight like that.
Well, it's like I'm back at work. Okay. Tell us, you mentioned helping investors understand markets, and I actually want to talk to you a little bit about that. I have a history degree, so I could tell you a lot about how there used to be these quaint terms called panics every 20 or so years in the late 1800s. And I could tell you, well, the market crashed in, the 1920s. But explaining why we had like stagflation in the 70s, I can't do that. And I'm just curious how you got into understanding markets, how you got into economics.
So when I was at Duke, my undergrad major was actually public policy studies. I minored in econ, but my major was public policy. And the reason I liked public policy is because it was a cohesive framework for understanding the world that was multidisciplinary. So, like you said, understanding history and having the depth of what's happened before is really important for understanding what's happening now. I mean, that's true beyond economics or markets. I mean, that's just a general thing, right? You're never going to be able to tell where you're going if you don't have at least a cursory understanding of where you've been. I do think that the I guess dynamism of markets is probably the thing that attracted me to the most. There's always something going on, right? It's never boring. It's never fully repetitive. There's always something new to learn. There's always someone new to talk to. And that really is that for someone who's intellectually curious and who is, wanting to constantly be stimulated in what they're doing, it's hard to find a better place for that than markets, especially if you've got a broad mandate to talk and learn and discuss and explain a lot of different things, as I'm lucky enough to have myself. So, yeah.
So tell us where we could go to be better consumers of that information. And if we want to learn about that ourselves, what resources should we seek out?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Pearkes, at Pearkes on Twitter. My firm, Bespoke Investment Group, also sells research, has free public research available. Our website's bespokepremium.com, BESPOKE premium.com, and at Bespoke Invest on Twitter. There's a ton of really good stuff in the podcast world. If you are sort of interested and want to get what's the hot topic right now and have it explained to you in pretty understandable terms. I love Odd Lots, which is it's a Bloomberg podcast hosted by my friend Joe Wiesenthal and another friend, Tracy Alloway. And they do a great job of sort of breaking down the latest thing that's going on. The most recent guest was an oil hedge fund, commodities hedge fund, but oil focused trader who walked through some of what's gone on over the past couple of months with oil prices, helping, sort of frame out why gas prices are so high, why, WTI, the benchmark for crude oil, went from $100 to $120 and then back to $100. And, I think it's just, there's tons of sources like that, but those are a couple you can start with.
All right. Stay on that. Why are gas prices so high?
Well, the simple answer is that basically people got tired of funding money-losing businesses trying to find crude oil. So if we go back to 2007, 2008, emerging markets had grown a lot. There were a whole bunch of new consumers of commodities in the world, and that eventually led to this sort of parabolic move in oil prices. Lots of financial speculation as well was involved in that. Crude hit $145 a barrel, almost just short of $145 a barrel. And then we had this global financial crisis where consumer demand disappeared and suddenly nobody wanted to, no one could afford to drive their cars anymore. Less commuting, a lot of people lost their jobs, just overall big drop in oil demand. Oil crashed down into, I think, low 30s is where it bottomed out. Economic growth rebounded afterwards somewhat, and oil went back to $100. But then because oil was expensive, historically, there was this big incentive for creativity and for new technologies to sort of explore for oil and extract oil. And what we call this today is tight oil or the shale patch, or basically all the crude that's produced in Texas these days. It's also North Dakota, a few other places in the US produce it as well. So that that process meant there was this massive surge in U.S. crude production. The U.S. is the largest producer of crude oil in the world, which I think a lot of people don't know. And we actually have a balanced petroleum trade balance. So before, in 2007, 2008, if you were putting gas in your car, probably that gas came from somewhere else ultimately, on a net basis. Now it comes from the U.S. on a net basis. So, so one of the consequences of the shale revolution is that you had a whole bunch of smaller companies all able to start drilling and put a bunch of wells in really quickly. It's a feature of the technology, very different from going out and building a drilling rig that has to go down to the seafloor and 10,000 feet of water and then drill another mile underneath that to get at the reserves underneath. Now, shale's really fast. You can spin it up and spin it down in less than a year. And so, this new technology can spin up and spin down real fast. Oil prices are high, so a bunch of capital plows into that sector. And about 2014, there was enough production that crude oil prices around the world crashed, went from about $100, $110 a barrel to got as low as the 20s in 2015, 2016. And so then oil prices were low for a long time. And every time oil prices ticked up, you had a bunch of people pile in. And through all this, all the people that were pumping this crude oil in the shale patch were losing tons of money. They were taking investor capital, debt, equity, putting a bunch of rigs out in the field, drilling a bunch of wells, and those wells didn't produce enough cash flow to cover the expenses, ultimately, at the end of the day. So fast forward to now, and oil prices have obviously gone up a lot, but all these companies are now saying, not all of them, but most of them are saying, we don't want to do this again because we've been told by our shareholders, you are not allowed to drill more than what's exactly profitable right now. You cannot go crazy with production. And so as a result, that swing producer in the global oil markets is now not producing as much crude as it needs to keep prices below $100 a barrel. The last thing I would say is that pop from 100 to 120, which is now reversed and will probably go back the other direction again, back up to 120 or something like that. That pop was because Russia, which is the fourth largest producer in the world, got taken offline by its decision to invade Ukraine. Combination of sanctions, individual companies making decisions, issues with insuring cargoes when they put oil on a ship to take it out of Russia, consumers not wanting to buy from them. So that's taken, roughly 10% of global oil production out of the market, or in large part out of the market. And so when supply goes down, prices go up, and that's the story now.
All right. And that's a great explanation. We're going to come back to issues with Russia because I want to get your thoughts on that as we go forward here. But one thing, I'm going to stay a little out of order here, but one thing that Mrs. Bull City Coordinators wanted me to ask you is whether we should be concerned about inflation at this point and why or why not.
Yeah, so inflation right now is very high compared to, if you'll permit me, a little bit of a historical digression again. You mentioned stagflation earlier. So stagflation is this process where inflation stays high even though unemployment's rising and GDP is falling or growing very slowly. So that was what happened in the 1970s. There's a bunch of reasons for it, but bottom line, inflation was high. And we didn't see that dealt with and start to come down until a series of recessions in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where the Federal Reserve just said, we're going to raise interest rates so high that inflation can't stay high because we're going to hit growth too hard. And we're going to create a much higher cost of capital to supply the economy with the capital it needs to incentivize people to save, to incentivize people not to spend. Really, really high interest rates. Obviously, that's super bad for GDP, super bad for employment. So, Fed Chair Volcker at the time had construction workers sending him 2x4s with messages written on them in blood. I mean, it was that bad, right? Because mortgage rates were 25%, 18, 19, 20, 25%. And the economy just choked on those high interest rates. Eventually, though, they got rid of high inflation. And so then inflation ran on a progressively weakening trend from the early 1980s through about 2019, 2020. That brings us to COVID. So the policy response in the US to COVID was for the Federal Reserve to be very aggressive expanding its balance sheet, cut interest rates to zero, pledge to keep interest rates at zero until they had seen very strong employment and or high inflation. And also there was a bunch of fiscal policy too, cash transfers, all sorts of support for businesses, for households, in a bunch of different forms. So what that did is it kept incomes really high, even though a lot of people lost their jobs, even though aggregate demand was relatively weak. And so the other thing it did is because of the pandemic and all this loose cash people had, it allowed them to spend a lot on durable goods. So, stuff that you buy for your house or a car or, that sort of thing that before the pandemic, maybe you don't care that much if you need a new couch or not, because you're not in your house that much anyways. You're going out to meet your friends at bars and so on and so forth. You work at the office. Well, during the pandemic, a lot of people want to upgrade their homes. A lot of people want to, buy. I picked up an Air Force One habit during the pandemic because might as well have nice shoes. There's not much going on. And so, yeah, there's this like swing in consumption where a bunch of people want to buy durable goods all at the same time. So that's created a bunch of supply chain issues, too much demand going through channels that aren't used to seeing big changes in demand really quickly. It's rippled through semiconductors industries, ports, basic fasteners, all sorts of industrial inputs. And really what it comes down to is this huge sort of student body left move, overload, right? If you're talking about a football play, it's, that guard's pulling and it's, he's coming downhill into the hole, right? And you do not want to be the linebacker matched up on him. And so, that has created a lot of issues for the global economy, both in the US and around the world. COVID shutting down production in different places has impacted it as well. And meanwhile, labor markets are really strong. Demand is high for labor, wages are strong. And so you've sort of got this perfect storm of stuff that is idiosyncratic and reasonably confident we can say that it will eventually work itself out. That's the supply chain stuff. That's the component shortages. That's, the stuff that just isn't working as well because demand swung around so much. And then there's the stuff that's more persistent. So for instance, wages for services jobs have gone up a lot and are pretty high right now. So if wages are high and businesses have to raise prices and workers have a lot of bargaining power, then they can go out and say, well, prices just went up, so now I need a raise. And then the cycle continues. There's not really good evidence we're in that cycle yet, but that's sort of the risk of being in a high inflation environment, is people thinking that inflation is going to continue and changing expectations based on it. So, I think inflation is a problem right now. How your policy response to that inflation is going to depend on what kind of problem you think it is specifically. I fall in a camp where my view is that we're going to return back. We're going to see a mean reversion in inflation. We're not going to have 7% CPI for long periods of time, just because things will sort themselves out. On the other hand, you've got people who think we need to hike interest rates, 1% in the next 2 months, basically, or 3 months. In my opinion, that's kind of asking for a recession. So the Federal Reserve has a tough job right now trying to figure out how much to pump on the brakes, whether it's going to be enough, just enough, or too much and send us into recession.
So to kind of dumb it down a little bit, unless you get the economic contraction and the job stagnation that we saw in the 70s, the inflation in and of itself may not be a problem.
Yeah, high inflation so the actual experience of inflation is regressive. So people at the low end of the income spectrum feel it worse. So any high inflation, whether it, if inflation is 7% versus 2%, all else equal, 7% is not where you want to be. That said, right, if inflation is 7%, but your wages are going up by 8%, then maybe you're not actually worse off, right? Like maybe you're actually okay. You might feel pretty bad about it. And that's what consumers are saying right now, that they feel really bad about the economy, even though we've got strong growth, high employment, high wages. They're more worried about the price of groceries and gas going up. And so, yeah, inflation is not good. The question is what is the source of that inflation? If that inflation is only going to be around for a bit and you've got a high confidence that it's going to go back down, then, using the government, whether it's fiscal policy, raising taxes or cutting spending, or monetary policy, raising interest rates. If you do that to slow the economy when the inflation was going to ebb anyways, you're creating a risk of creating a recession for no reason that you didn't need to do. Now, the flip side of it is what we got in the 1970s, where everybody had, inflation was going up and up and up, and everyone thought, okay, prices are going to keep going up, so I need to adjust my behavior. And that adjustment in behavior creates more inflation, and it just keeps going. And so that is when the central bank really has to step in and cut things off if they don't want a sustained continuing path of inflation. The last thing I'd say about inflation is that high inflation is or any amount of inflation is a social choice we all make, right? Whether it's through primarily it's attenuated, but primarily the way we make that choice is through who we send to Congress and the White House. If you don't want a lot of people to lose their jobs, then you can't complain too loud about inflation. If you are really worried about making sure that everyone who wants one has a job, then you're going to have to tolerate a little bit more inflation. And so I think that sort of trade-off is kind of lost on a lot of people. And I know this audience of this podcast, I'm probably so far over folks' heads here, and I'm sorry, I'm just kind of going here, but I would just, for lay people, I would just stress, like, higher inflation isn't all bad. And, it's painful, but it depends on what else is going on. And right now there's a lot of good stuff going on that stopping inflation, working to stamp it down really fast will stamp down that other good stuff too. So, yeah.
Okay. I got what you're saying. I want to stay on this because you mentioned the supply chain issue, the semiconductor problem. Some of us may or may not know about the Taiwan miracle and all that. But that's an issue. We depend a lot on Taiwan for our chips, for our semiconductors. How do you fix that? How do you work that out?
Well, yeah. So Taiwan is not the only place in the world that you ultimately source semiconductors from, but they're dominant in a vast majority of semi inputs. Basically, the foundries. Taiwan Semi is the world's largest semiconductor producer. They're based in Taiwan. Semiconductors manufacturing is really interesting because it's super complicated. It is sort of like doing extremely detailed surgery, like neurosurgery, right? But doing it millions of times and millions of times per chip, and you're producing chips at a scale that boggles the mind, like billions of chips, right? So millions of neurosurgeries across billions of chips is basically what you're doing. And so getting everything set up to do that, right? Not just the actual physical equipment and the plant layout and the physical capital of a factory, but also the human capital of managing all those processes, not just people working on the line, but people managing them, people that are used to troubleshooting some of the problems that you have with this kind of highly complex process. Getting all your input supplies ironed out. Where is that silicon coming from? Where are the other input metals coming from? And then also like your network of customers, right? Who are you shipping your chips to, and how much do they rely on you? There's a lot that goes into this. And this is what economists call a network effect, right? Once you get this network, and Taiwan Semi and Taiwan as a whole are a good example of this network effect in action. Once you get that set up, it's really hard to dislodge it. You can, but it's expensive. And so that is where industrial policy in other countries comes in. The US has started to focus on semis with funding from Congress and industrial policy initiatives to lure actual manufacturing of semis to the United States. And B, to defend the intellectual property. So like the research and development of these things takes place and is controlled by the US for the most part. So, defending that intellectual property and expertise in design that the U.S. has, while also trying to bring some of that physical manufacturing process back to the United States. And, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars to do this, and, a decade plus process. This is not something you just flip on and off like a light switch. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough problem. The reason semiconductors have had so many issues with COVID is because a huge buyer of semiconductors is the auto manufacturing industry. And when COVID hit, all of the auto OEMs virtually just canceled their orders. And the chips that they typically use are not super sophisticated chips, but they can go into other stuff. So when all those orders got canceled because, US recession, we're going to go to very low auto sales, quick cut production, cut expenses. It turns out that's not what happened. Auto demand was actually really high. And so now all this demand comes back to the semiconductors manufacturers, but those semis have now been sold. They've been sold to personal electronics manufacturers, other kinds of durable goods manufacturers, what have you. Maybe factories have been shut down, and getting back into that sort of flow process before is really hard. And we're still feeling ripple effects from that today. So I think a good analogy for this is if you're driving along on the freeway at 75 miles an hour, and all the lanes are full, but you got 2 car lengths, and everything's flowing good. Well, some Yahoo slams on the brakes in the lane in front of you. You're going to slam on the brakes, which causes the person behind you to slam on the brakes, and behind you back all the way. And before you know it, what was a very high speed, smooth flow of traffic down the freeway is a parking lot. It'll sort itself out eventually, right? A new equilibrium will be established as everyone spaces back out and gets back up to speed again, but it takes a while. And that's what's going on in semis, and I think is going on in a lot of other areas as well right now, and is one of the big reasons we're having so much inflation.
Well, that's interesting what you said about the semis and the auto manufacturers expecting something to happen based on kind of historic events. And then you wonder if they had just waited to see how things had played themselves out. We're not having this problem, which reminds me of the old adage, sometimes leadership is actually doing nothing and not a quick decision, and then you don't have the problem. And sometimes it actually takes more leadership to say, no, we're going to wait and see before we do something.
Yeah. And it's really I mean, honestly, I don't think anybody, when COVID hit in February of I can remember seeing stories on it in the first week of January. That was when first week of January 2020, it was like, oh, something's going on here. Like, it's probably not as bad as it looks, but I need to start paying attention to this. And, by early February, it was clear, okay, this thing's going to be global. It's probably not going to kill everyone, but if it just runs wild, we're going to lose millions of people in the US, let alone the rest of the world. And this is going to be bad. And then when those sort of state level stay-at-home orders started rolling out, when by that time the decision had been made, in Detroit and at a bunch of companies around the world in terms of how much they were going to produce, because they're never looking a week ahead; they're looking quarter, year ahead, right? And no one could have predicted that the way the virus was going to evolve. We've gone from a completely novel virus that is just wreaking havoc on most people, right? Like it's a serious disease and it's killing quite a lot of people. To we have a fully effective vaccine. And by the way, the virus has already mutated to something much less threatening, much more endemic in the space of 2 years. No one could have foreseen that. And no one could have foreseen how much policy stimulus we get. Congress coming in and effectively underwriting every small business in the country. That was not a thing, right? So, I understand where car manufacturers were coming from, because if the recession had played out anything like it looked like it would in February and March and April of 2020, they would have looked like geniuses. They would have saved their investors billions of dollars. And it's tough. As someone that forecasts and does financial markets for a living, this has been the most challenging 2 years of my career for sure. And it probably won't ever come close. Nothing else will come close, because it's just been so hard to get it right.
Well, and I think the projections were somewhere around 25 to 30% unemployment if the government didn't step in. I mean, it was there were some really ominous signs up ahead that, led to a lot of the actions that you were talking about. But I'd like to get your thoughts on, we mentioned earlier, Russia invading Ukraine. So we're probably going to get targeted by hackers for mentioning this, Russia, but I believe in actually telling the truth. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on, I hate to use the term the West, because that's what Putin tries to lump us all together and make us, the West is the bad guy. But I just want to get your thoughts on the response of the EU, the United States, and the other countries as to the economic sanctions and really the economic warfare that's been applied in response to Russia's invasion.
Yeah, I actually wrote a piece for this at a think tank called the Atlantic Council. We may be able to link it in the show notes or something like that. I'm not sure if you do that ever, but the basic idea here is that the United States, and to a lesser degree, but a non-trivial one, other countries like the European Union, the UK, the next tier down would probably be your Switzerland's, your Japan's, your Canada's, your Australia's. These countries have a very high degree of control over how their currency is used. If you want to hold a US dollar bank account, ultimately every dollar that goes in and out of that bank account has to be processed through American law, and specifically New York state law. So that doesn't matter if you're a citizen of another country, if you're getting a payment from a citizen in another country, whatever. At some point, that dollar is going through a U.S. bank account. It's going through a process that's directly controlled by the U.S. government. And because the U.S. dollar is so important for moving value across borders and for facilitating trade around the world in commodities, in all sorts of other products and services, it is just so important that the US can flip that switch. I mean, if the US wants, they can say, okay, anybody in Russia is no longer allowed to transact in dollars. Of course, they can't control cash, but cash isn't super helpful. When you're talking about modern, financialized, and post-industrialized economies that are entirely reliant on very liquid, very fast-moving financial markets for basic flows of goods to take place, it's a big stop button. And the US has done a lot. The US, EU, and the UK have been sort of the leaders on this. They've done a lot in terms of stopping the flow of transactions by Russian entities, but they could go a lot further. I mean, it could go a lot further. It's so far, the basics of what they've done is they've created lists of people and financial institutions, companies, including the Russian central bank, who are no longer allowed to move assets along the payment rails in dollars, in euros, in pounds, in one form or another. That's sort of how all three have approached this. They could extend that to everybody in Russia. I'm not sure if they will, but they could, hypothetically. And so that means that if you're a Russian company trying to sell your oil to, let's say, a Turkish refinery, you're going to transact in dollars. You cannot find liquidity for the Turkish lira versus the Russian ruble. That's not a thing, right? Like, you can't do that. That FX pair just doesn't really trade. So you got to go through dollars. You go from rubles to dollars, and then dollars to lira, or vice versa, whatever. And to do that, you got to go through a bank somewhere. And a lot of banks have just said, look, we're allowed to deal in an energy transaction. We're allowed to facilitate this payment from this Turkish refinery to this Russian crude exporter, but we're just not going to do it. And by the way, you can't insure the cargo when it leaves the port. So good luck getting it there on a ship. These flows or this ability to turn the network of dollar payments on and off is just incredibly powerful for dictating economic activity. And over the long run, you can find ways around it. That you can substitute away. But in the short term, I mean, Russian GDP is going to be down 25, 30% in the first half of this year. It's like another COVID shock, but the problem is there's not going to be a quick rebound. There'll be a rebound, but it won't be very big. And so they're in deep trouble. And I'm not sure that's sunk in the Kremlin yet.
Well, I wonder if this is how we're going to see wars fought in the future. as opposed to
hopefully.
Right. Well, I mean, do you think about it? Short of boots on the ground and drones and planes and naval ships and the submarines and all the stuff that involve human capital, right? And I'm listing them one by one. You could go through all the old school ways of fighting wars, right? That involves human capital, right? With the exception of drones, but you got to have somebody to man it. I mean, do you think that this is how we're going to really see the future of modern warfare?
I mean, my hope is that countries that are feeling aggressive towards a smaller neighbor will look at what has happened to Russia and say, we couldn't do that. Like we would not be able, our regime, our population, however you want to frame it, whatever political construct is at work, we would not be able to survive that sort of shock to standards of living. And so, if that's the cost you have to weigh against whatever benefits that might exist to going to war, you're going to think real long and hard. And, I think one of the reasons there was a war, there is a war in Ukraine. One of the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine is because they thought that they had done enough to sanctions proof their economy. I'm using scare quotes around sanctions proof. They switched a lot of their international reserves into gold and other currencies. So they thought they could avoid the US dollar being restricted. They basically thought that it was just going to be the US doing what's going on. And the problem is it's not. It's, as you said earlier, the West, which I agree that term is sloppy because it includes countries like Japan, right? And the sort of developed democratic world has in lockstep with no real exceptions said this is not going to fly with us. And in some economies that's coming at great cost. You think inflation's bad here. In Germany and in Italy, the energy dependence on Russia means that it's rough, and it could get a lot rougher. Russia hasn't really cut off flows of gas to Germany yet, and Italy is also highly dependent. It could get real bad. We're coming out of winter, thankfully, so I don't think it'll be a question of life and death. But yeah, it's tough. So I think if you balance the old way of fighting war, and there haven't been a lot of nation state level conflicts since World War II. There've been a lot of civil wars and a lot of low grade wars, but generally the world has tilted away from nation state level wars. But if you compare the sort of destruction that you're seeing in Ukraine right now, shelters for children being targeted with artillery, civilian corridors being bombed with cluster bombs, that sort of cost compared to Russians not being able to buy an iPhone, having their basic caloric needs met, but otherwise not really being able to have the standard of living they enjoyed before. I think that's a pretty reasonable trade-off to make. It's unfortunate that the Russian people are caught in the crossfire to a degree, but at the same time, the disincentives and the problems that are created by these sanctions are very significant if they're from the entire developed democratic world at the same time.
Well, and if the sanctions are as effective as they appear to have been so far, it's going to get very difficult for Russia to continue to fight in Ukraine. And let's say they take Ukraine, they're going to run into the same, it looks like, problem they had in Afghanistan with the Soviet Union, where they sort of took it, but they couldn't maintain it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a military analyst, but I'm following this stuff really closely. I will be surprised if they can continue doing anything other than sitting in their current lines past the next week or so here. So one of the sort of fields that studies warfare these days is called open source intelligence. So this is people that take publicly available data and try and understand what's going on battlefields with it. Sounds like it's kind of, wild hair, make it up type stuff. But some of these analysts have documented hundreds of Russian tanks destroyed, each individual one documented separately. You can look at the photos. It's all very transparent. So by my math, 120 battalion tactical groups, roughly 10 tanks per BTG, company of tanks, 10 tanks per BTG. And with over 200 tanks destroyed since the invasion, they've gone through like roughly 20% of the best case scenario for the number of tanks they've had on hand. They haven't even taken Kyiv yet. They haven't taken Kharkiv, which is literally on the border with Russia. Mariupol, which is where they've had their biggest successes in the southeast, is holding out after over a week, coming up on 2 weeks of intensive siege. How can they continue to do this? And that's before factoring in that they can't get the microchips they need to build more cruise missiles. They can't get the high-end aeronautic components that go into MiGs, right? Like, where are they going to come up with the resources to continue fighting this war when they're suffering the kind of attrition they are? So hopefully Putin comes to his senses sooner rather than later and pulls out. But in the meantime, every day he doesn't, more Ukrainians die, and more totally innocent Ukrainians die. Not just people who are putting on the colors of their country to defend their homes, but children, elderly people, cancer patients. Like, it's horrifying. So knock on wood that it ends as soon as possible.
What kind of countermeasures do you think can be taken by Russia against the U.S.? And again, I'm going to use that sloppy term, the Western, air quotes, bloc.
So in the short term, nothing. They thought they had taken countermeasures by reducing reliance on dollars and reducing reliance on, switching to gold with international reserves, building up a lot of international reserves, that sort of thing. But like, there are physical flows that they are reliant on for their export sales. There are physical flows that they're reliant on for key components in their economy. 20% of their imports are machinery, right? Of one kind, of electronics, industrial machinery, that sort of stuff. They don't really, they produce some of it domestically, but nothing like what they need to replicate the menu of products and services that were available before the invasion. So in the short term, nothing. In the long term, trade with China, like barter trade essentially with China, where they're sending oil and coal and natural gas and minerals to China in exchange for manufactured products. That's a viable solution, but that's going to take a really long time. And we're talking not months, but years and years for that to get to the same point that it was before the invasion. And even then, it's not going to be quite the same thing. It's going to be a substandard set of, not because Chinese goods are bad, but just because China doesn't produce all the stuff that Russia needs from the West to maintain the economic activity it had before the invasion. So yeah, there's no good options. Straight up, they're up a creek.
So I guess to stick with kind of analogies that dumb it down, it's like when you leave your girlfriend and you're like, she's going to need me, and then she's fine, but you're the one in trouble, right?
Oh yeah. I think what's a good analogy here? It's like if you have a really big, complicated jigsaw puzzle and you take half the pieces and you throw them in the trash. Can you still do the puzzle? Well, hypothetically, yeah, you can cut the cardboard to the right size. You can get the picture of the puzzle and print it on the pieces of paper, and you can do it eventually, but it's going to take a long time. It's going to be real hard. And you're going to not be working during that time. You're going to not be spending time with your kids. You're going to be siloed trying to get this thing put back together, and it's going to be tough. So yeah, that's kind of the analogy.
All right. So it seems like what happened here was that Russia thought there was going to be a real quick, easy war that they'd be able to get over and done with real quick, which anybody who studies history knows. I don't think there has I think it's like 9 times out of 10, the predictions of quick, fast wars are wrong. They turn out to be long, drawn out fights. So if you're ever in a position of power and someone is promising you that a war will be over quickly, fire that person and go talk to somebody else. But it's interesting, though, to watch this economic development and market development of the response to what's happened in Ukraine as a result of Russia's aggression. Again, I don't care what Tulsi Gabbard says, that's what happened. But I'm just curious, and then we'll switch to football. But I would like to know your thoughts about, are companies, are, again, air quotes, Western companies, going to go back to Russia when this shakes out, when it's done? Do you think we're going to see like Coca-Cola go back there? I mean, what's going to happen?
Well, just before I answer that, I would point out the quote, you know, the phrase "a short victorious war" was actually something a Russian said about the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. And yeah, so history doesn't rhyme, or doesn't repeat, but it really rhymes sometimes. So yeah, as far as Western companies, I mean, that really gets to the nut of it, right? In terms of that ability to produce at the level you were before. BP is a really good example. They had a huge, like $20+ billion on their balance sheet joint venture with a Russian gas company, or Russian oil company. Sorry, and they just said, we're pulling out. We're not going to sell it. We're just going to write it to zero. We're just going to assume it's worth nothing. We're just stopping all engagement. The loss of technical expertise, of access to suppliers, of project management, of, you know, geological engineering and all that stuff. I mean, that oil fields are not something where you stick a pipe in the ground and just comes out indefinitely. You got to work to maintain them. They take a lot of maintenance capex, and that's gone from that joint venture, right? Like the Western expertise to do that efficiently is gone. And you know, there's a bunch of other examples as well. And so, yeah, I even if BP wanted to go back tomorrow, it's going to look really different. You know, I have a really hard time seeing, given the cost that some of these companies have accrued. Again, in the BP case, it's like more than $20 billion it cost them to pull out. It was like a quarter of their market cap. Given the magnitude of that decision, you are not going right back in. You're not just going, okay, now we'll go back in. No, that's not how that works, right? Hundreds of aircraft right now, for instance, in Russia are impounded, essentially. They're owned by leasing companies around the world. AirCap is the biggest one. They're headquartered in Ireland, traded in the US. But, you know, they've got all these airplanes that Russia is just, no, you can't take those out because they don't have access to parts. So they're gonna have to cannibalize planes to keep any domestic plane service flying. Well, if you're leasing or if you're insuring an aircraft, and you know, or you own an aircraft, how eager are you going to be to let that land in Russia anytime in the foreseeable future? Probably not super stoked about it, to be honest. So, you know, I think these ties are slowly built, and they're compounding. So once you get, you know, they grow at faster rates over time, they're exponential. But when you break them, you go back to zero, right? Or if not zero, then something like it. And the eagerness to get right back into it is going to be very low, in my opinion. And you know, eventually they might, if we see a return to democracy in Russia, if we see a totally different foreign policy from Russia, if we see an actual effort to engage with, you know, their neighbors and their trading partners in a constructive way, then anything can happen. But in the short term, there's just no reason to think that's going to happen anytime soon. So that's that.
All right, let's switch gears, talk about football. You grew up in Canada. You have a very famous ancestor. If you'd like to just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my great-grandfather, a guy named George R. Pearkes, he was basically a pioneer, early 19th century homesteader in Alberta. The Great War broke out, and George R. headed off to Europe. He ended up winning the Victoria Cross, which is the equivalent in the British Empire of the Congressional Medal of Honor. So peak military honor you can earn. He took shrapnel in the leg and kept on ticking in Passchendaele in Belgium, which was a particularly muddy and awful battle. He held a key strong point against a bunch of waves of enemy attack while injured. Ended up going into politics after he came back. Took a spin through the Mounties and then went into politics, took a spin through the Mounties and then went back to military service. By World War II, the start of World War II, when it broke out in Europe, he was commander-in-chief of Canadian forces in Europe. They rotated him out to the West Coast because they thought that the Japanese were about to invade. And so he was in charge of West Coast defense during the most of World War II. He then went into politics, got elected to Parliament, and ended up being the Minister of Defense under Diefenbaker's government in the 1950s. And that was his career. He spent the later part of his career in a ceremonial position called the Lieutenant Governor that exists in Canada. There isn't an analogous one in the United States, but Queen's representative in British Columbia is literally what it was. I grew up in British Columbia, a small town called Nelson. My dad went to college in the States. Loved watching the Cowboys, loved watching football, American football in general, thought CFL was trash. And so I grew up thinking that CFL was trash. And I mean, I can appreciate what CFL offers, but it's not for me, I don't think. And the strategy certainly in the American football, both at the collegiate and professional level, is another thing entirely. Anyhow, I grew up watching football on Dad's knee. And, I can remember being in early part of high school or middle of high school and watching that Tostitos Fiesta Bowl where Boise State took down Oklahoma and just thinking like, man, I got to get me some of this. I got to be involved in this. So I got into Duke back in spring of 2008, got an early decision, called up the football program and said, hey, I just got accepted to Duke. I want to walk onto the team. And this was at the time when Cut had just been hired. So this is, I probably called within weeks of him being hired. And I didn't even really know anything about all that. I just called the football program and I called the tight ends coach and Googled the tight ends coach and said, I want to walk on as a tight end. And they said, okay, we'll get back to you. A couple of weeks later, they got back to me and said, all right, if you can show up for training camp and make it through training camp, you got a spot on the team. The Duke walk-on program now, to my understanding, is very different from where it was when I played. But when I was there, they could not attract enough bodies, right? Like they needed anybody that wanted to play, as long as they weren't going to get themselves hurt. Like as long as they were physically fit enough to, not get hurt in practice, they were good to go. And that was me. That's how I became a Duke football player.
Well, so I'm scratching out my questions about Canadian football culture based on your prior statement. I take it you don't have a CFL team that you keep tabs on.
I don't keep tabs on them, but I've got a weak spot for the Hamilton Tiger Cats because when I graduated, they sent me a letter asking me if I wanted to try out. Now, I didn't do it because, well, first off, I wouldn't have made a team. Yeah. Here's the thing about the CFL. The CFL has to have a minimum number of Canadian players on each team. So right. My theory is the reason I got a letter is that they just went through and sent a letter to literally everybody that was listed as being from Canada on a D1 team that was a senior. I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Didn't end up wanting to spend much time in Hamilton, and that's the end of that. But it was fun to get the letter.
Well, I would say listeners of the podcast know from our most recent interview with Trey Hornbuckle, we know about the Canadian ratio rule there. So, and I assume that you also have listened to that in preparation for today and are aware that we all know about that too. But man, you should have done that. That would have been awesome.
I had a job waiting for me in Manhattan.
Okay. All right.
I was like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah.
But, Chris Rabacumba went up there. He was a contemporary of mine. He was probably a year or two older than me. But he ended up playing for the Tiger Cats he wasn't from Canada, but he ended up playing for them for a while. I don't know if you've had him on. But he would be a great guest. He's an awesome guy. A couple other guys I played with ended up spending time. I think Thad Lewis was up there for a little bit. Probably a couple other people too, maybe A.B. Croma. Not sure, but yeah, CFL is cool. It's, I don't want to be too harsh, but it just wasn't for me. I was at that point after 4 years being a walk-on and essentially a tackling dummy, right? Like I had enough of football. It was an incredible experience. I wouldn't have done it any different way, but it was time to move on.
Well, the job in Manhattan goes a long way to your decision-making process, right? If that wasn't there, then maybe you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go try out for this team. But I get it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was good. I mean, football is football at the collegiate level, and certainly in the program that Cut ran. I mean, I can't speak for every program, but having been through his program, it is an incredibly intensive experience. I mean, the only thing I have ever come across, and I've never served in the military, but the only thing I can sort of liken it to, and based on what I understand of it, is the military. Just incredibly regimented. You have to be here at this time and on this date. You don't have a choice. You're then going to be in physical danger, right? I mean, football's a dangerous sport. They did a good job protecting us. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they were abusing us or anything like that. But at the end of the day, it's a contact sport, right? So it's physically dangerous. You've got this intense, really brotherhood with the people that you're going through this with, and not just, you've got sort of the same system of enlisted people and NCOs, right? Like team captains or team leaders, graduate students too, as well. You've got your officers who are the coaches. You got a big general up at the top calling all the shots, right? So, it's very hierarchical. You got a whole physical and infrastructure around. You've got your uniform. You've got, your food is provided through this system. I don't know. It's very intense, and I think it's very constructive for young men. I found it very constructive for myself, and I saw a lot of people benefit from it. But after 4 years of that, it's like, okay, we're good here.
Well, tell us a little bit about, you were there for the very beginning of the Cutcliffe era, which I've referred to at the site as the rebuilding and renovation era. Can you walk us through kind of what the mood was like coming into that first season under Cut? Because, I mean, they had been really bad for a really long time.
I think they won one game in like 2 or 3 years before that 2008 season, if I remember correctly.
We don't need to remember that. We'll just say we don't need to get into that. We'll just say that they were bad. So yeah, okay, but
yeah, and then so Cut comes in and he is just an incredibly competent, serious man, right? I think almost sometimes there were times in meetings where it was like, okay, you're doing this you're doing a little much here, Cut. It almost took it to an excess in certain circumstances, but regardless of the affect, he was very serious about what he was trying to do. He had a plan. He had a way he wanted to do it. He had a culture he tried to instill in people. And I think he was very successful in it while I was there, in terms of just setting expectations and demanding a certain level of performance. The team, when I first got there, was a really interesting mix of guys who had been recruited under Ted Roof, who were actually pretty physically accomplished. Thad Lewis is a great example. Vince Ogabasi, who was a 5-star, I think, DT when he was in high school. I can remember lining up against him one of my first snaps on the field in practice. I mean, it's just practice. He's not trying to kill me, but it's like, oh man, okay, this is different. Like, this is not, these dudes are on a different level. I'm not a bad athlete, but this is just, I'm never going to be one of these guys, So anyhow, I think, then he had some guys mixed in that were just oddballs, right? Like, there was one guy, and I'm not going to say who it was because it's kind of mean, but he was recruited under Roof because they got his name mixed up with somebody else. And so, he was on the team and he contributed, and this is not some guy, everyone had a role to play, but that's kind of the variation that Cut was working with. and getting guys to buy in and care, and getting guys to understand that, like, if you do this the right way, then it will come, right? The good stuff will come, whether it'll come in the next practice, it'll come in the next game, it'll come in the next season, whatever it is. Like, that we have a system and we're going to work it, and it's going to work if you buy in. Getting guys to connect those dots was, I think, a big challenge. And I there were certainly a number of guys who got shipped out, essentially. Like, not, oh, you don't have a scholarship anymore, but just like, you are not going to be what you think you are on this team. We need space. So take an injury scholarship, transfer, whatever. This is not a good spot for you. And that's tough. But it took I think by the time I was a junior, there was a huge amount of buy-in from guys. And, there were guys who had been there under the system for 3-4 years. And, you saw, some of the product of that, whether it was going and playing Johnny football down in Atlanta in the Georgia Dome for the Peach Bowl in 2012, I think that was 2013. Thank you. Sean Renfree's, superlative performance, late in his career, that sort of stuff. It started to click, and, they never got it over the hill to where it was going from that 3 to 5 win team to like a 7 to 8 win team every season. And it's hard, it's competitive. It was never a guaranteed thing, but going from that first set of meetings that I wasn't in because I was still in high school, but I came in later that year to start my freshman fall. And, hearing some of the stories of like, wow, from guys who had been under roof and seeing what Cut was trying to do, wow, this is real different. This is a very serious thing now, not some goofball up there.
So then it took some time, and you had 2 seasons that were big improvements upon where Duke had been. Your first season 4-8, second season 5-7, and hovering right around the bowl game. What were those 2 seasons like? And then compare that to then the next 2 seasons, the 3-9 seasons.
So I think that first season, the thing I'm always going to remember, that sort of like what it's like to be underestimated. Thad got hurt. Thad Lewis was our starting quarterback. He got hurt. And there wasn't a ton of confidence that the backup quarterback, and I'm not going to use a name. If people want to Google it, they can Google it, but I'm not going to use a name. There wasn't a ton of confidence in the throwing arm of the backup quarterback. But the backup quarterback was a pretty damn fine athlete on his feet, and he could take a hit or two. So in the space of a week, the entire offense was thrown for the week in the trash can, and they installed a triple option scheme from nothing. We played, I think, 4 triple option teams that year. It was Army, Navy, Georgia Tech, and then I think it was at least 3 and maybe one more. So a lot of the guys on the team and on the staff were comfortable with this triple option scheme, at least in theory. And so they designed it straight from the ground up, whole new offense, whole new scheme. Went into Blacksburg. I didn't travel for that. I traveled very rarely. And actually, I got a good story about traveling. Traveling with the team. Again, I was a walk-on. I was not high on the depth chart ever. And so I didn't travel with the team most of my career. But they went up to Blacksburg. And it's a freezing cold winter night, and, Enter Sandman's blaring, and those crazy turkeys are going crazy. And, they held them to 1 touchdown and 1 field goal, if memory serves. We scored a field goal, and there were probably 3 or 4 plays that should have gone for touchdowns because they had never seen this offense before. And so, that kind of scrappy, like, do whatever it takes, get creative, ride and, just drive it home and just do whatever we can to break out of the cycle. I think that's how the first 2 seasons felt. And then those later 2 seasons, it's like, okay, like, we can be competitive with just about anybody we want. So let's go out and get this thing done. And then it just not being there. It just, being a few snaps short, in competitive in every game, and just a ball breaking the wrong way, something going wrong, and not being able to get it done. And it's just frustrating. A couple of years after, ended up playing in a premier bowl game. And that was, I think, the high watermark for the program.
All right. So couple things that I want to mention. You said the backup quarterback could take a hit, and boy, did he against Virginia Tech. Those who have watched Blue Devils football for a long time know who you're talking about and know the hits he took in that game. But you said you had a good story about traveling. I don't know if it's going to require an explicit rating on the podcast or if it's.
Oh, no. Actually, I think it speaks a lot to what Cut was like in terms of instilling that culture. So every year there's an event at Wallace Wade where the freshman class comes to meet the Blue Devils, right? And they meet the football players. It's a sort of like a pep rally. There's free pizza and they sit in the stands and, whatever. And so after that, the football freshmen we were still in training camp, but we were living in dorms at that point. It was after the hotel you live in for the first few weeks of training camp. And there was a group of us milling around, and I noticed that a bunch of the freshmen had left their pizza plates and soda cups and whatever in the stands. So I just start picking up trash. And another one of the scholarship guys, and I both started doing this. I don't know if we did it at the same time or it was one of our ideas or whatever, but we both started doing it. And everybody else is just kind of jawing, talking to girls or doing whatever their thing, whatever. And we're picking up trash. And I think there were custodial people there to do that as well. But, we just chipped in. And so that was, I guess, a Friday night or a Thursday night or something like that. And we practiced the next morning. And at the end of practice, Coach Cut, we do a little announcements and stuff at the end of practice every day. And Coach Cut says, all right, Curtis Hazelton, George Pearkes, you stand up. And I go, oh, what did I do? Why does he even know my name? This is bad. This can't be good. And he said, I was sitting up in my office in the Yo football building after y'all had your little freshman event. And I looked out and I noticed that Curtis and George were picking up trash after all those little freshmen that were out meeting the Blue Devils. And that is exactly the kind of thing we want in this program. It's your house. You clean it up and you take pride in this program. And so because of that, the two of y'all are going to get to travel to our next game. And so, or maybe it wasn't the next game, but it was a game that season, I think. And so one of the games I was never going to play. I didn't have the skills. I didn't have the athleticism to take a snap, but I went with the team down to Georgia Tech. And that, I had never seen a convoy of buses coming from the charter flight to the hotel with a state trooper, leading the way and all that. And, coming from a small town in Canada and, seeing all that, it was like, wow, this is wild. And, the reason I got to see that is because Cut really wanted to reinforce that, like, if you do the right thing, good stuff will happen for you. And so I think that's a good example of how that was.
Well, that's a great story. And I want to turn to the one thing that you said about the last two seasons. There were so many close losses. Looking at 2010, lost by 6 to Wake Forest in a shootout, lost by 5 to Maryland, which I despise Maryland. I won't even get into that right now. Hopefully everybody who listens to this podcast does, but you lost by 5 to Boston College and 5 to North Carolina. One play in each game goes a different way. It's a very different season. And similar in 2011, there were just a ton of close losses that we've detailed previously with other guests. So your career ends, your time at Duke ends. What was kind of the mindset, if you can comment on it, for the team going into next season? And I know you weren't there for it, but what were the guys who were coming back thinking about what maybe they could do?
I think by the time I was leaving, you at that point had guys who were entering their 5th season with Coach Cut, right? And who, Sean Remfrey is a great example of this. Jeff Ferris is another good example. He's, has had now a pretty impressive coaching career up to this point through both Duke and I can't remember where he's at now, but he's continued to coach. He's the offensive coordinator somewhere, if I remember correctly. But those kind of guys who had been out there and been drinking in the cut mindset, not just the attitude and, doing the work, but also the system and, understanding how the system worked. And so that, compare that to guys who were recruited by a different coach and are having to adjust to an entirely new way of looking at the game, in their third, fourth year, when Cut first came in, like that's a big difference, right? That sort of confidence and that sort of familiarity with how everything works. I think that is the big thing that would have distinguished that year. And obviously that builds, right? By the time my second or third season, that was starting to become evident. My fourth season for sure. But, by the time that fifth year, everybody who's there pretty much is a cut recruit, right? Like everyone's come with that cut mindset. And, I say cut recruit, cut mindset. There was an amazing staff of really talented coaches, other than Coach Cut. Guy like Ron Middleton, who's now an NFL coach and has been for quite some time. He was my position coach and, just a fantastic leader of young men and just really knows the game to an incredible degree, knows every single where every angle needs to be on every block and knows every technique and every trick and knows everything top to bottom. There were a number of coaches like that. That mindset and that sort of familiarity with the system, I think, really set up a lot of guys for success. And it took one more year before that what should have been, or I wish had been, like a breakthrough season that set the tempo for the team and was repeated again and again. It didn't end up working out that way, but that 2013 season was still pretty special.
All right. So watching those seasons, the bowl games after you left, the success that the program reached, the draft picks who went in the NFL, as a former player, how did that make you feel observing that?
Oh, just so happy for the guys that got the chance to play professionally, for those that wanted to. I mentioned Chris Robacumbo playing in the CFL, but, Laken Tomlinson, who was, I believe, a year behind me, maybe 2 years behind me. He just signed with the Jets. He's had an amazing career. Lucas Patrick, he was another guy similar age. He plays for Green Bay and has done a great job. There's a long list of guys. Those are just two off the top of my head. Obviously, there's a long list of other guys who had pretty successful NFL careers. As to the team success, I mean, some of the guys catching touchdowns or making blocks or making tackles or being in the right gap, like, I helped them get to the point where they were doing that. I played a small role in that. It's not like I coached them or anything, but, I was one of the people who was in the weight room working hard or running sprints hard, even though I wasn't getting a scholarship to be there, and motivating them. And I was giving them looks in practice and all that stuff. So, that first couple of seasons out, I felt a ton of ownership over what had happened. Not possessiveness, but, I felt like I had played a role in building that for sure. Obviously over time that feeling has faded a bit, but on a personal level, but the gratification from Duke winning a close game is a lot stronger, I think, than just about anything else. And, the basketball team's great, good for them, but it's different when it's the football team winning for me.
And Lucas Patrick just signed with the Bears, so I'm sure there's a ton of Green Bay fans who are burning jerseys right now since he went to the rival. But on that thought, I'm just curious, on that note, rather, Coach Cutcliffe's time came to an end. We've covered that extensively. We've talked a lot about that at the site. What are your thoughts on Coach Elko and what he's doing?
I don't know anybody that's still super close to the program at this point. All the guys have aged out. Even, like I said, Jeff Ferris was my year, but he obviously left with the Coach Cut transition. I don't have any insider read on Coach Elko. I certainly can't say anything negative that I've heard or anything like that. I think it's really, really hard ahead of time to prejudge how a given coach is going to be. I think whether it's just hype and, fans being excited, as they're, totally understandable to be, with a change, or the athletic department doing their job and marketing things well, whatever that the case may be. There's always a lot of excitement with a new coach, and you just really don't know until you see the product on the field. So, I can't really offer any sort of super strong vote of confidence or critique of any kind either. But what I would say is that, I hope Coach Elko does real well with the guys. And, I think he's got a lot of support behind him, both from fans and, from the university. And, hopefully he's one of the college coaches that gets handed the keys to the truck and lets her rip. And I'd love to see that. And hopefully that's what we'll see this season.
Yeah, I think he's done all the right things since he's come in. I think he's trying to engage with the program. I mean, as someone who's followed the team for a long time now, football was an afterthought at Duke for a long time, and they paid the price for that. But he seems very invested. He's doing all the right things. But I will say, as I've said before, and I'll say it again now, one, we need to be patient. And two, we need to see what happens when he gets on the field. I like the staff that he's put together. It looks like they're recruiting very hard, and hopefully they'll be able to take what's there and put a real competitive, good product on the field, because I think that's what we want to see. And until now, he's done everything right. Let's just hope it continues come September and come the games. What's one thing, two other things that I want to cover with you. First, what could we as fans know about what athletes are going through that would help us be better fans? We saw a member of the program step away recently and medically retire. You've been around guys there for 4 years. What should we know to be better fans?
I think just keep in mind, like, regardless of the facts of a given situation, which fans are never privy to, you're never privy to all the facts. Like, straight up, you're not going to be. You can be well informed by what's out there publicly, but you're never going to have the whole story. Regardless of what the real story is, what the story that you can see or can, perceive is, just remember that, like, the person on the other side of whatever judgment, good or ill, that you're passing, whether it's a coach, whether it's a player, whether it's someone in the athletic department, whoever, like, that's a human being, and they're just trying to do the best in the situation they're in. And, especially for a late teens, early 20s young person, right? There is all kinds of stuff that can be going on in their life that you have no idea how bad or how good. I mean, this is not just about, like, oh, fans need to be nice to players or something like that. It cuts both ways. You just don't know how bad or good it could be for somebody. And so you just need to be really careful about objectifying, I guess, like, a player for good or for ill, either way. They're human beings who are just trying to make their way in the world. And, all sorts of stuff goes on. I personally, compared to where things were when I was there, Duke was great with concussion protocols. And I always felt like my safety wasn't at grave risk or unnecessary risk while I was a player. But I will say the sport as a whole has come a long way in terms of understanding the risks that players are at, with regards to head injuries, and understanding the times that sometimes people just got to step back, right? And so I am really happy to see that in the sport, and see that as a step to supporting players become better people and become, safer in their endeavors.
Last thing, well, as an attorney, I should never say that. So apologies if this isn't the last thing, but intended last topic. What are you most proud of about your time at Duke?
That I made it through 4 years as a walk-on at a D1 school, having played, like, scrub Canadian, like, 9-man football before that. Like, I mentioned Curtis Hazelton earlier, who was was the other player who helped me clean up after the freshman event the one time. And, he said I think we were coming off the field in September, October of my junior year. And he said, Pearkes, man, let me be real honest with you. Nobody thought you'd be around for more than a couple of weeks. You had nobody. The pool was not looking good for you, man. Like the over under was real low, and you're here. You're here like everybody else. You're working your ass off. Good on you. And that was a lot. Going through college, not being able to work a side job for beer money. Not being able to dedicate as much time to scholastic endeavors as I otherwise would have, having social life cramps, all that stuff, and not getting a scholarship for it. And I still made it through. And it was don't get me wrong. I got as much out of it in terms of my personal development and my experience of the world as I put into it, I think, if not a lot more. But, I'm proud of myself for that. I'm not going to lie. I think that's one of the more solid achievements in my life. And, I made the decision my freshman year. I thought I was going to come in and be Rudy. And it was very, very clear very quickly that was not going to be how it worked, right? I was never going to be the guy working my way up the depth chart, earning a scholarship or anything like that. But that didn't mean that I couldn't get something really positive out of the experience and contribute in my own way and contribute in a way that the team needed. And so, making that decision freshman year, I'm never going to be the guy, and that's fine. I can still play a role and still contribute, still get a lot out of this experience. I'll give myself a pat on the back, my 18-year-old self, a pat on the back for that, because it was a really good decision, and it's made my life a lot better.
Well, that's great. And George, we thank you for taking time out of this Thursday evening to come on and do this interview. And for any of you out there who are listening, who are associated with the program in any way, past, present, or future, you know how to get in touch with me, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. My DMs are open on Twitter @DukeFBCoverage. Go to our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. We're always happy to talk Duke football. And we are working on lining up a few more guests. Got one into April, working on one in May, trying to line a few things up. And then my summer gets, unfortunately, a little brutal, but we're going to keep working on setting these up. We thank you for continuing to listen. Go Duke.